It only takes a few weeks before the name Boris Johnson comes back. It's kind of like sort of Tony Blair just pops up, doesn't he, every now and again in saying, oh, well, Blair's back with a permatan to throw his spanner into the works. Mr Johnson, in a similar vein, saying there is now a strong case for Britain to have a referendum on its membership of the European Convention on Human Rights. The former PM argues that the ECHR, adopted back in 1950 to protect a person's right to life, security, freedom and thought of expression, might not provide people with protections that they wouldn't otherwise have. Of course, it's become a key issue in the Conservative leadership race. I think I'm right in saying Robert Jenrick is the only one that is pledging to actually withdraw from it. The other three aren't going there. Let's speak with Catherine Barnard, who's Professor of EU Law, University of Cambridge. Catherine, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Nice to have you with us. If I can invoke a sort of Monty Python-ness to the first question, what has the ECHR ever done for us?
Quite a lot. It's given us rights for protection or against discrimination on the grounds of homosexuality, particularly in the armed forces. It has given put a lot of pressure on UK government to make sure it investigates scandals like the Hillsborough disaster properly. And so it also is there as a backstop for individuals who feel that their rights have been infringed. And it could be you or me. We think of it's there, and all the narrative is about helping terrorists and so forth. But if my kids were taken away, or your kids were taken away, or if my house was being removed, I would like to have some body of human rights to appeal to say, look, this is just not fair.
But if somebody was removed, on that specific example, somebody had taken my kid, I mean, I would call the police. Obviously, I would go to the... I wouldn't think of going to the European Court of Human Rights.
Yeah, but if the state is taking my kids away or my house away, I would like to go to have a body of law to turn to say, look, this is not right. And in fact, the European Convention on Human Rights is part of UK law. It became part of UK law when under Labour, under the new Labour government back in 1998 with the Human Rights Act. And it allows people to challenge decisions made by the state which affect you and me potentially on a day-to-day basis. It's not just there to help other people.
It was, am I right in saying, Catherine, it was there before, but it was a little more labyrinthine to get to it?
That's exactly right.
So it made it more accessible in that respect.
Exactly right, yeah.
Boris Johnson's point is that, well, we've got laws that cover all this stuff anyway now, so, you know, job done, no need to worry. Everybody can resign, we can all go home.
Well, you might say that, and indeed he might say that, but the reality is one, being a member of the European Convention on Human Rights, at least, and as you say very helpfully, as it's implemented in the UK, does mean that there's an external check on anything that is done by the UK government. And while one government may be to your liking, another government may not be to your liking. You'd like to have some external body. Secondly, it keeps our rights up to date. Yes, of course, the British courts can take a view on human rights, but ultimately anything that the British courts do can be trumped by Parliament, and Parliament could pass a law to reverse a decision of the British courts. Having an external body there keeps an eye on what we're up to. Thirdly, some of the things that were done under Boris Johnson, in particular the withdrawal agreement. Now, you'll remember that was the divorce text when we left the EU. Special provision, I realise I can see you beginning to shake already.
Well, I was having a good day up until you mentioned the withdrawal agreement.
The withdrawal agreement gives protection to the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, and that's premised on our continued membership of the European Convention on Human Rights. And another point which also was agreed by Boris Johnson when he entered into the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, that's the deal in which we trade with the EU at the moment, is that if we're going to share data, particularly with our security forces, we've got to be in the European Convention on Human Rights. So the things that he is advocating at the moment, including leaving the ECHR, will leave us very exposed in terms of trying to keep us as safe as a country. And
of course, the reason this is a live issue is essentially down to channel migration. That's the whole backstory of this. Rwanda, the constant argument, well, the ECHR will stand in the way of this, it will usurp a democratic decision by the British government, etc. And some arguing that the ECHR has, if you like, overstepped its mark. Its tentacles are reaching into places that back in 1950 it was never intended. Is that a fair assessment?
So the European Convention on Human Rights and the Court of Human Rights, it's what's called a living instrument. And of course you would expect it to be kept up to date, because issues that were not big issues in the 1950s are now of much greater concern, of which, for example, rights for LGBTQ+ is a good example. Environmental issues, not a big issue in 1950, are an issue today. So you would expect it to be kept up to date, and the court is responding to that. But the fact is, if we were to leave the ECHR, and I realise it's a policy choice, it's still not going to stop the boats, because those people getting on the boats are desperate to come to the UK. And it was well known that the Rwanda scheme, whatever the rights and wrongs of it were, was not acting much as a deterrent effect. There were still hundreds of people coming most days when the weather was good. And so these tweaks to law will not send the signal that the government, or then government, now opposition party, say will lead to stopping the boats. And the reality is, even were we to leave the ECHR, the British courts would not allow breaches of our other international obligations, particularly the Geneva Convention on Refugees.
A point we covered a little earlier, actually. There's lots of other facets to this story, not just the ECHR. What would have happened then had the Conservatives stayed in power and Rwanda went ahead and some smart lawyers decided, right, we're going to take this all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, and we will attempt to do our very best to try and overturn this. If the ECHR had decreed that Rwanda was illegal, would their decision be legally binding?
It would have been legally binding, but the bigger problem is what to do about enforcement, because what the European Court of Human Rights does not have is an army to send in to try and enforce its rules. Yeah. So we would be in breach of the rule of law, we'd be in breach of our obligations. But ultimately, that is a decision we as a state could take. Now, generally, the UK government takes its commitments under international treaties seriously, and therefore will comply with rulings of international bodies.
So it's a curious... Now, sorry to interject. It's a curious... point within the entire legal structure that it's a legally binding decision, but it just by definition can't actually physically be enforced.
Exactly right, and that's where the big difference is between the Council of Europe, under which the European Convention sits, and EU law, because in respect of EU law, the European Union, had we not complied with some decision of the Court of Justice, then the Commission could have brought proceedings against us and we could have been fined. Yeah. And you see that with Hungary at the moment, where Hungary is not complying with EU law, and therefore Hungary is being subject to quite considerable fines and also having some of their funding docked. None of that applies under the Council of Europe. Right. But on the other hand, we see ourselves as a law-abiding country. And if we're encouraging other states to abide by the law, we need to be seen to be doing it as well.
There is a school of thought, and I assume Robert Jenrick is of this thinking. I don't know if he's contacted you at all, Catherine, in recent weeks.
You'd be surprised to know he hasn't.
Has he not? What a shame you've not had that photo. I did actually bump into him just outside here a couple of weeks back. He seemed a very nice man, but he didn't mention the European Court of Human Rights. Had a government done this and attempted to leave and, Rwanda, or ignored a decision by the European Court of Human Rights, what are the implications if we did leave it? Other than joining Russia and Belarus on the naughty step, what would actually happen? How would other countries react to it? I can see Mr. Macron and Scholz and others on the world stage saying, we condemn this decision, but would that be it?
No, because what would happen, it would have direct consequences for the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. That's the trade deal we have with the EU. The trade deal with the EU is premised on our continued membership of the Council of Europe and being continued to be a signatory of the European Convention on Human Rights.
The tricky area, I suppose, just a final point, Catherine, that certainly many of my audience struggle with, I know, and lots of us scratch our head on this, is that... If our Supreme Court said, we looked at Rwanda, for example, absolutely tickety-boo, it's good to go, rubber stamp, and then it gets to the European Court of Human Rights and they have a different decision. What is it about? I mean, they're not innately better lawyers. They don't have some oracle of Delphi there that they dive into for the ultimate decision. What is it that makes that law or that decision superior to the one that was made domestically? Because many people say, well, hang on a second, we're a democracy. Surely we make our own rules on something like this.
Well, on your first point about the Supreme Court said that the Rwanda scheme, as was presented, was not lawful. But I think your bigger question is the democratic point. Why should we listen to an external body? And the simple answer to that is it's good not to mark your own homework. Particularly over things as important as this, it's good to get an external perspective. And that external perspective may be unpalatable at times, but other times it's led to changes in our law, particularly, for example, protecting the rights of gays in the military.
But could you not then extend that logic and say, well, we'll have another court that's the Northern Hemisphere Court of Human Rights, and then we'll have a global one after that, and everybody can keep checking everyone's homework?
Yeah, that's true, and to an extent that already exists because the UN has a Human Rights Committee. But the fact is, you have 47 now, 46 with Russia gone, states of the European of the continent of Europe who broadly share common values. And the key thing is that any decision of the Court of Human Rights gives what's called a large margin of appreciation to national systems. So there's quite a lot of flexibility within any ruling that the Court of Human Rights gives.
Just a very final point. A question came in from Els who says, could you ask Catherine why the EU isn't a signatory to the ECHR?
It's trying to be. In fact, it did sign up or try and sign up back in 2013, but there were all sorts of technical concerns about the process of going to the Court of Human Rights and how the Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice, and the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which is the Court of Human Rights, whereas the Court of Justice, which is the EU Court in Luxembourg, how they work together. But it's trying again as we speak.
And do you not sense that, you know, we know what happened with Brexit, a lot of European leaders, I think Mr Johnson wrote about that in his book as well. He's in the headlines quite a bit this week, which is always great material for us. But he made a point that Macron has never really got over us leaving the EU. Some might say that if you mentioned trading and how there could be an effect on trading with us leaving, is that just bad sportsmanship on behalf of other countries, or is there any good reason why people would want to punish us for taking a democratic decision to leave something?
Well, the EU's answer to that question would be the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, that's the trade deal that we trade with the EU under at the moment, is premised on the fact that we share a certain amount of common values. And most importantly, if we're sharing personal data across borders, then it needs to be underpinned by the European Convention on Human Rights. And the sharing of data is really valuable to the police. It's part of their tactics to keep us all safe. And longer term, of course, if we were to pull out the Convention on Human Rights, it would also pave the way for the EU to terminate the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which would mean tariffs on our goods, making our goods much more expensive going into the EU, so there would be fewer bought. And it would also just make trade 100 times more difficult.
There it is. Catherine, we really appreciate your time. Thank you for being with us. Professor Catherine Bernard, Professor of EU Law, University of Cambridge. There was a lot she said in that. Pick apart the bits that you thought were worthy of some challenge.